Hello, my name is Garrett Pattison, and I'll be presenting on first wave feminism and the 19th Amendment. I think these are really interesting things that everyone should know about, so I hope you enjoy my presentation and what I have to share with you today. So you may be asking, what is feminism? Here I've provided some different definitions from various sources to try to provide some diversity in these answers. So Oxford Dictionary defines feminism as the advocacy of women's rights on the equality of the sexes. And Wikipedia says that feminism is a range of social movements, political movements, and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. And Britannica says that feminism is the belief in social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. So what we're seeing between all these definitions and through the heart of feminism is that it is the equality of the sexes. And I actually kind of, for the first time ever, I agree with Wikipedia more. I prefer that answer just because it makes sure it points out it is the political, economic, personal, and social equality, because equality can mean a lot of things. So I enjoy how it points it out. So next. So when did this all start? So feminism, it can be traced back to a lot of different ways. It's kind of not sure like a very definite beginning. But the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 is a pretty definite start to the first wave. So Seneca Falls, New York, it is a convention where all these activists and radical thinkers of the country come together and they talk about all sorts of stuff. But feminism is kind of the main thing. And they actually make this thing called the Seneca Falls Declaration, which is really interesting. So it is a sort of parody almost of the Declaration of Independence, sort of like if the Declaration of Independence is America's breakup letter with Britain, the Seneca Falls Declaration is women's breakup with the patriarchy. It's really interesting. It's kind of, it has like some crazy thoughts. Not crazy, but you know, it was kind of out there. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I will talk about later, she and others drafted the Seneca Falls Declaration and outlined the new movement's ideology and political strategies. And actually, in its early stages, feminism was interrelated with the temperance and abolitionist movements. So here we're seeing a sort of fight for equality, not only amongst themselves, but for others, which I think is really cool. So next. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So as mentioned earlier, she was at the Seneca Falls Convention, really cool. And she was a author, lecturer, and chief philosopher on the women's rights and suffrage movements. And she formulated the agenda for women's rights that guided the struggle well into the 20th century. And she helped start the organized feminist movement. So we wouldn't, like this thing wouldn't exist without her. So thank you, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for your contributions. We thank you. So here, I think it's interesting to note, or important to note rather, the difference between the NWSA, the AWSA, and the NAWSA. That's a lot of letters, so I'm gonna slow down. I'm gonna make sure that I don't miss anything. So first, the NWSA, and that stands for the National Women's Suffrage Association. So the NWSA was more radical, and they focused on a range of women's issues. They focused on like birth control and a woman's right to start families, and also the vote, but they also like coverture and like, all these other things. So they made sure to represent a lot of women's issues at once, which is really cool. On the other side of that is the AWSA, and that stands for the American Women's Suffrage Association. I'm sorry. And the AWSA was a little more conservative, not conservative in the sense of liberal and conservative, but more, I mean, more, they focused purely on the women's right to vote and the whole suffrage movement. They thought that if they tried to focus on all these other issues, that the vote would get lost in the shuffle and would never be granted. So they wanted to focus purely on the vote. So in 1890, the two merged to form in the NAWSA, which is kind of just called NASA, just because it sounds cool. And that stands for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We saw her, really cool. Also Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony, who I'm sure you've heard of. So now I'd like to talk about Alice Paul. So perhaps before I get into Alice Paul, I should talk about sort of the old generation and the new generation, because there is like a couple years between Alice Paul and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Seneca Falls Convention. So in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's time and NASA as a whole, they were going state to state to petition states individually for the right to vote. So that's why you get states like Wyoming, who had women's suffrage before the 19th Amendment was passed. So they would go state to state, and these individual states would grant women the right to vote, and that was cool. Um, However, Alice Paul, as I'll talk about later, she wanted to focus more on a national amendment so that all women were included in this. So Alice Paul was one of the most prominent activists of the 20th century women's rights movement. An outspoken suffragist and feminist, she tirelessly led the charge for women's suffrage and equal rights in the United States. She dedicated her life's work to women's rights and equality, and she challenged the rather conservative approach of NASA. So she wanted to, as previously stated, she wanted to do the national amendment so that all women left behind. Meanwhile, NASA was still trying to do the state-by-state model, and they kind of disagreed about that. So at odds with NASA over tactics and goals, Paul and Burns founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, CU, in April 1913, but remained on NASA's Congressional Committee until December of that year. And 2 months later, NASA severed all ties with the CU, and the CU eventually changed its name to the National Women's Party in June of 1916, shortened to the NWP. So the NWP was a lot more radical than NASA, and they actually directly picketed the White House, and they targeted President Woodrow Wilson, and they were directly calling him out, which is something unheard of, because they're like, NASA was more of a please give us the vote, we really want this, and the NWP was like, no, we're getting this vote, like, no. They had pickets, they were targeting the president, they were quoting the president on their pickets, it was a whole thing. So the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted American women the right to vote the right to vote, a right known as women's suffrage, and was ratified on August 18th, 1920, ending almost a century of protest. And Woodrow Wilson actually didn't support this until 1918. If you wonder why, there's this little thing called World War I that was going on, a lot of history happening at once. And actually 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which is really cool. So who cares? Well, I care, but I also encourage you to care. The right to vote is commonly taken for granted, and I feel like as a culture and as a society, we tend to forget how much work and how much fighting and sleepless nights and the years without representation that people had to endure to fight for our right to vote. So I encourage us to take advantage of that today. And I think this story is important to that. So moral of the story, vote. Please register, vote. Please vote in every election that you can, every election that's meaningful to you, and make sure your voice is heard, because these people lay down their lives to ensure that we have that vote. So please utilize it and honor their memories and history. Here I've given some sources, presentation, and yeah, so I've also included a handout. I would encourage you to look at the handout, do some research for yourself, go to these sources, really dig deep, and yeah, thank you for learning about women's history with me. Thanks, bye.